And now your host, Richard Thomas.
Hello, and welcome to another edition of It's a Miracle. Once again, you're going to meet some very lucky people whose lives have been changed by prayers, dreams, and other unexplainable acts of good fortune. We begin with a story of friendship and courage that pits two men against one of the most deadly forces of nature. In a word, Avalanche.
So now, what do you have to say?
I said, I must be crazy being up here. I don't know how I'm going to get back down.
For Methodist minister David Moss, the best part of every winter is an annual weekend ski trip called Snow Madness.
It's been a highlight of my life every year to do this with these guys.
Okay, you guys. Here's Dennis.
This is the international symbol for help.
What do I look?
I have a good friend, Dennis Eucalyptus. We have known each other for over 20 years, and he has been going on Snow Madness trips for almost that length of time. We leave on Thursday, stay there for the weekend, and on Sunday, we always end with a special service with communion and then ski down back to the cars.
See you next year.
But even though they all promised to meet again the following year, it didn't work out as planned.
Normally there's a big group of us going, but everybody canceled. And Dennis and I ended up the only two, the smallest annual in our history.
The two men chose to climb Mount Lassen, a national park near David's Northern California home.
We had checked the Weather Channel. They said that it would be fine weather until Sunday, and that there would be some precipitation on Sunday, but that was the morning we were going to leave. So we decided to go ahead. We could not have picked a better day. It was just gorgeous up there.
David and Dennis started up the mountain, heading for a point 3.5 miles above the trailhead where they planned to set up camp.
Being out there is such a special feeling. It's a spiritual feeling for me. It gives you a sense of serenity. No interruptions, nothing to draw your attention away from it, the beauty and the simplicity of it all. It's very healing.
But by the next morning, the weather had made a sudden and dramatic change.
Dennis, you better come out here.
The snow was coming in at a sort of a slant in big flakes. So that's the first time I had a little anxiety about this storm. It was coming in earlier and stronger than we expected. And there was still lots to do.
I think so.
All right.
I told Dennis we better get going, have our breakfast, pack everything together, and do the communion and get the heck out of there.
Do this in remembrance of me. Do this in remembrance of me.
As the two pastors performed their communion, the snow was covering the tracks they had made the day before.
We left about 10 o'clock in the morning in the blizzard. The snow was flying in our face, and it created a kind of a disorientation where you couldn't tell up from down.
Without tracks to follow, the men were thrown off course and were heading straight into Avalanche territory.
We were going to have to go through that Avalanche area to get home, and I was really beginning to worry that we were in some danger here.
As an added precaution, the men decided to tie on avalanche cords, but David couldn't find his.
I've got another cord on the backpack. Could you bring it out for me?
The theory is, if there is an avalanche, these cords will kind of float to the top, and anyone that survives can see the cord and follow it to your buried body.
I'll be right with you.
So I was working on my cord, and he set out ahead of us. I got myself put together and started behind him. I remember Dennis entering the Avalanche field. In a very calm way, he said something like, "Time to advance." I assumed that he meant, "I'd like you to lead now." And I picked up my pace a little bit, watching his tracks. And then I got the shock of my life, because all of a sudden I realized his tracks disappeared. And that's when I realized that what he had said was Avalanche. And he was gone.
Dennis! Dennis!
I had a whistle, and I blew it, but he didn't return the call.
Dennis!
I looked into the teeth of the storm as far as I could for evidence of his cord or a hat or a glove or anything. There was nothing. I realized he was under me somewhere, and he was dying.
Moments later, Dennis disappears. Knowing that his friend is buried somewhere beneath him, David uses his cell phone to call for help. But it will take at least an hour before rescuers can arrive.
I knew that if I didn't reach him within 30 minutes, most people die. I figured I only had one good chance to reach him before he died, and I didn't know where to start. I didn't have a clue, and I prayed to God, where do I start?
Dennis! Dennis!
I began where his tracks disappeared, looking frantically for that cord, for an item of clothing, for anything, any clue. And the time went on, the ticking, and I could imagine him struggling in there.
Dennis!
He had to be somewhere below me,
Where are you, Dennis?
gasping for breath.
As David dug frantically for the next 2 hours, his exposure to the cold began to take its toll.
I was beginning to lose strength. I was starting to shiver uncontrollably. I didn't think he'd be alive, but even if he wasn't, I wasn't going to stop. It was a sense of terrible loneliness when you desperately need someone, anyone, to help you dig, when the stakes are so high.
By now, the rescue team had been trying for hours to reach what they believed was David's position and found nothing there. At this point, Lassen Park Ranger Mike Lalone considered the mission more of a recovery than a rescue.
People that are buried by avalanches don't survive much longer than about 30 minutes. It was pretty unlikely that he was still alive.
The team decided to spread out on foot and search the area, not knowing that David and Dennis were still a half-mile away. 2 hours later, they still hadn't arrived, and Dennis had now been buried for 4 hours.
I was slowing down because I was losing strength, and I was beginning to feel a hypothermia. Time sort of lost its meaning, and quite frankly, I was beginning to panic. And I wanted so much to find him and pull him out of there. I just prayed for those guys to reach us. I heard the crackling of a radio, and I thought it might be the trick of the wind, because that's happened many times before.
Go ahead, Mike.
But it was no trick. It was rescue volunteer Frank Ward, who had seen David's skis crossed in the snow.
And as I got closer, within maybe 10 or 15 feet, Dave popped his head up out of the hole.
Hello, you David?
Yeah.
And inside of myself, something kind of let go, and I started to shake uncontrollably.
Frank radioed the other rescuers, who soon arrived. While they prepared to search for Dennis, David was taken back to the snow cab to get warm.
Right over here. Watch your step.
Okay, so we need to...
Meanwhile, Frank and the rescue team were trying to locate Dennis's body.
We put the dog on alert, and wherever the dog reacted, we began to probe. And it was basically a first response probe. You know, see what you can find.
But after several attempts, they'd found nothing.
I was waiting in the bombardier, wondering what was next. It was like the avalanche hit me emotionally right then, and it gave me permission to feel the full weight of the undeniable fact that Dennis must be dead. That my friend of 20 years died in front of my eyes.
Rescuers finally arrived on the scene and began searching. But by now, they had given up all hope of finding the man alive. And then, suddenly...
Feels like I hit something here. Let's get digging here.
Check it out, Nick. Check it out. Check it out. Good boy. He's confirming, Frank. You've got it fine.
I wasn't feeling real exhilarated at this point. We'd been out for like 5 hours now. And the chances of finding a survivor at this point beats all the odds. But I felt like you have to keep going against all odds. Got something? Looks like we got a glove. I didn't really want to do it, but I reached down and I grabbed the glove. There's a hand in it, Mike. We got him.
Okay, confirmation. We do have our second victim.
The dog began to react very violently to human scent. And at that point, somebody over my shoulder said, "I hear moaning." And I dove back down the hole. Dennis, are you with me? This simply shouldn't have happened. John, give me the O2, will you? And I just kept going, yes, this is a good day.
Debbie, Mike.
Go ahead, Mike.
Debbie, we need some oxygen up here. We also need some more shovelers.
It took me a moment to sink in, but I realized Dennis must be alive or they wouldn't need an oxygen bottle. And I hooped. I hit my head on the top of the bombardier. And I couldn't believe it.
Hey, Dennis, we're right here with you, babe.
Miraculously, after 5.5 hours buried under nearly 6 feet of snow, Dennis Eucalyptus was still alive.
Dennis, it's David. It's David. We're going to be home soon.
It took about 45 minutes to reach the chalet. On all that time, Dennis didn't respond to us whatsoever.
Dennis, can you hear me?
And I was terribly worried he was gone. His mind was gone.
Dennis was rushed to the hospital, where Dr. Dana Ware was standing by.
I was concerned that he had been cold enough and without oxygen long enough to where he would have brain damage. But within about an hour of being in the emergency room, his body temperature was up to 94. He was fairly coherent. He had absolutely no evidence of frostbite. I was absolutely astonished that he had survived so intact. There is no scientific explanation. Science would have had him dead and buried. I think what happened to him is a miracle.
When David arrived at the hospital a few hours later, he was relieved to find his friend awake and alert.
As soon as I entered, he turned to me and he smiled. And I said, "Dennis, your middle name ought to be Lazarus from now. You've come out of the grave."
I took him by the shoulders and I said, "David, if it wasn't for you, I wouldn't be alive. I'm here today because David did exactly the right thing."
I can't explain it any other way that this was a miracle. That one of us survived to be able to get help. That is a miracle. That the phone worked so that I could get help. That is a miracle. And that probe was only 6 feet long and his hand was 5.5 feet under the surface. And finding his hand in that avalanche field is astounding to me. I'm just awed by the fact that God has touched us all in a very special way.
Comes
It's a hot dogger.
Oh!
Out of control.
The 22nd annual ski trip went smoothly in February of 2001. And for Dennis, being able to return to the wilderness with his friend is the greatest miracle of all.
David and I, we always felt we were somewhat brothers before. But now, having faced death in this way, I actually owe my life to David.
Dennis, how you doing up there?
I think in some ways that will bind us together in a way that we probably can't even articulate. I absolutely think that this was a bona fide miracle.